I wanted to bring up something that I get asked about a lot, and that is how did I tell my story? I get asked by other people, you know, how did you do that? How did you decide? What did it take to tell your story? Well, first and foremost, it wasn't a straight shot. So it's not like I told my story um, one day and then all these things happened. I knew that in telling my own story for the first time and not even telling any details about my what had happened to me, I felt a sense of relief. And luckily for me, on the other end of me telling my story was my best friend Caroline, my sister Karen, my mom and dad, and then eventually my sister Susan and other friends that I would talk a little bit about things, and they all believed me. So it doesn't matter that I didn't say everything at age 16 when I started to disclose, and it was dragged out of me that first time as I was scratching the carpet down in Karen's bedroom, that shag carpet. And apparently I've told this story before. I should let my sister Karen talk about it at some point, and she has talked about it a little bit on one of our podcasts, but it was one of those scariest experiences of her life because it was like The Exorcist, it was like Linda Blair, with her head spinning around. And that's how it felt to her because of my kind of almost out of my mind scratching at the floor. And just as the information came out of me, it was like a purging. And for her at age 14, she was 14. This happened when I was 16, and realized that no aliens were going to come, and I wasn't going to be completely taken out. I thought that they would vaporize me, and that meant that my body and my spirit would be non-existent, and that was very scary for me. Because I believe, and still to this day, I believe that we have a spirit and that spirit will go on and that I will still be me in the afterlife or in other lifetimes or however it happens from there. But that my energy and my matter is unique to me, and that I'm going to be around for eternities. So that was a very scary idea, that I would not exist at all, that my physical body and my spiritual body would all disappear. I didn't want to disappear. So I find that interesting as I think about, okay, so you already had that innate thing in you that you didn't want to disappear. You wanted to be alive. You wanted to be spiritually alive. You wanted to be physically alive. And as strong as the grooming and the brainwashing had been, my will to be alive and to live was stronger than all of that. And I believe most people who are survivors of this kind of trauma, sexual assault, abuse, grooming, brainwashing, violence, their inner spirit, their mental person that's they're in your head, and sometimes it's like they're one on this shoulder, it's like you have a split personality. One's telling you you're worthless and just give up, and the other one's saying no, you're not, you got to keep going and figure out how to not feel so worthless. Because both of those things are real. I think that you have, most people, except those that maybe really do struggle and they need really truly to find that therapist and to find the medication that can take away that horrible, hopeless depression, but because that's real, that really doesn't let you feel that way. Those that are harmed in these ways often also find a really strong desire to keep going, and I certainly had that in me. So knowing that about myself, looking back on how did I tell my story and how did it happen, I first of all knew that I wanted to live. And so I've already talked about those years right after, I finally disclosed to some degree to those closest to me, who believed me, who loved me, who it was unconditional, like nobody ever really truly asked me a question about, like, that would make me feel bad, like that would make me feel like it was my fault. I already had those feelings because of the groomer, the predator, the experience, but no one in my immediate circle made me feel bad or worse, that somehow I had deserved this, and that I did this to myself somehow, and that I wasn't to blame. That's what I got. You're not to blame. Even though that took a very long time for that feeling to go away, um, to put in place a lot of other, almost what I would call techniques on how to change my thought patterns, how to change my emotional patterns and my brain, for my brain to recreate or create new pathways that were positive and that felt good for for me to be able to feel like I actually do matter and that I'm worthwhile. I did have a strong desire to live and to be whatever I thought at the time was success. You know, for me, it was good grades. It was being in the plays and the musicals. It was serving, you know, other people in my community as a teenager, at my church, you know, doing those sorts of things that made me feel like I was worthwhile, and that I was a success. Some of those things, as I talked about before, were sometimes based on, you know, things that are fleeting, you know, a certain way that you look or a certain part in the play, or, you know, how, you know, do you have a boyfriend or you don't? Or some of those things were not grounded in the real sense of self that I did finally develop, and that came back to me, like that sense of freedom, like I just am, and that is enough, and that's good. That took longer, but it did come back, and I do think that I fought for that, even if I wasn't aware that that's what I was fighting for. So in telling my story, the time when I really felt that come to pass for me was right after my son was born, and wanting somehow to make sure that I protected him from everything, as parents want to do. They want to protect their children from everything, which you cannot do, because they're going to have their life experience too, and they're going to have trauma. Um, you hope not to pass it on to them, that you've broken that cycle. I don't think I had broken that cycle yet. I think my, you know, multiple relationships and marriages and many losses that he experienced, um, did have an effect on his life, and that was traumatic for him. And now he's an adult, and he has to figure out how to deal with his trauma, and how to manage his will to live, and how to live, and how to improve, you know, his life, and make, you know, those things happen. It's, you can't do it for another person, and you don't prevent all trauma or life experiences from happening, you know, to your children, as much as you want to prevent them from being in pain or being hurt or harmed. Um, so I've learned how to forgive myself for that and those things, and to stand in a place like my parents did, where how can we support, how can we love you, how can we support you? Um, we wish we could fix it. We wish it never would have happened. Um, Now I'm practicing that, you know, in my own life, with my own relationships, and after he was born, and knowing that I was going to protect him at that time, when I was 27 years old, from everything bad in the world, um, I knew I wanted to tell my story. And getting invited to share my story at a book club that a friend of mine that I was working with at Disney World had, um, that was the first time that people asked me those questions. And I was like, okay, I think I do have something to say here. And it kind of opened up, like, what is there to say? And the first piece of that puzzle had happened a little bit earlier, when I wrote that paper in college, and I had to, you know, it had to be a long paper. It was like, had to be like, I don't know, 20 pages or more, type, you know, on a typewriter. No computers then. Yeah, I'm old. Um, well, I'm older, but, you know, I remember doing that project for my English class for my grade, really. And that was the first time that I had really written anything about it, other than I was a pretty good journal writer. It was something I did quite frequently through my college years and my teenage years and my early years. I had a little diary. It was something that I did, and I didn't do it every day, but I did it, regularly. But most of the things that I wrote about were very much in the current moment, and definitely during those years when I was kidnapped, and brainwashed, and all of the sexual assault was happening. I did not write. I didn't write about it, any of it, because I was afraid that maybe somebody would find that, and that wasn't allowed. Nobody was supposed to know. No one was supposed to know anything about what was going on. It was top secret. And I thought someone could get hurt if they knew, and that I could get hurt. So I didn't write a lot. And that first project in college is when I opened up more to my parents, and I would call home and talk to my mom. And so as I would, and my dad too, I mean, I would talk to him as well, but a lot of conversations with my mother, especially, that were really important, and being able to voice my feelings about what had happened and having her listen. My mother's an excellent listener. Um, Always has been, still is. And so when I got to the place of having my son, and then at age 30, I had gone to the Landmark Forum and done, um, I had done a course. They call them courses. It was a workshop, basically, 3-day workshop. And I really found a lot of freedom that came out of doing that course, the forum. And after that, I started communicating on and off with my mom and asking her things like, could you write a timeline for me of what was happening at home while I was missing? My grandpa, my mother's father, had passed away during my first kidnapping, so I wasn't there. My mother was dealing with a missing child, and her father, passing away. And then I came home and no Grandpa Buck. He wasn't around anymore. And other things that were kind of big events that I wanted to know the timeline. They were all mixed up in my head. So by the time I was 30, I remembered a lot of things, but I couldn't remember timeline. It wasn't in order, which is very common. Fractured memory is a thing for survivors. You remember things, but they're fractured, and they're not in order, and it's not a smooth transition from what happened to me, and now I'm wanting to write about it or talk about it or tell my story. That it wasn't like some smooth road. There was no roadmap or guide on how to do this. So I started with my mom, and we would talk anytime that I'd come home from school, on a vacation, there was a holiday or something, and we'd talk about it, and she'd write things down, and she was trying to keep this timeline for me. And as she was doing that, she started writing about our experiences. And little did I know that she had started writing about some of this before I even asked for the timeline. She was writing it from her own perspective of what had happened to her, and how it had, just kind of in almost like a history. Like, she wanted to make certain that people knew, like, I don't know, just her family. I think she was only writing it for herself, and maybe for her, children, to have something to read about this time in our lives after maybe she was gone. And so it became kind of this natural flow where she would take what we had talked about, making a timeline basically, but also writing about those events that I would talk about. She would basically record them, she'd write them down. And so this happened, over and over again. And so, life goes on. I've got a child to raise. I'm getting married and going through various things in my own healing journey that I didn't even call a healing journey at the time. But now, looking back on these things that I was discovering, I knew, and I now know, that was part of my healing. And so as I would kind of go through another, difficult life experience, another, is called a life situation, if you're Eckhart Tolle, and you're teaching us about living in the power of now, the present moment, and how we can do that and free ourselves from our past and the trauma then and the worry of the future, because the only moment you have is the present. I was listening to some of those. I have the CD set and I still have them in my car that still has a 5 CD player thing that happens in my car because it's a 2007 Honda hybrid. And I still have them in there. And I've had them in a different car before that when my son was pretty little and he was like, "What is this? It's so boring." You turn it off because every time we'd get in the car, that would play once CDs became a thing. So I have that book on CD and I still listen to it to this day. So anyway, those things are happening in my life. I would talk about various things to my mom because I'm going through stuff, I'm living the life. I'm the lived experience of going through a divorce or going through a new relationship, and a hopeful happy marriage is coming up. And then, here's a play I'm doing, or I'm involved in this or that. And so all through these times when I'm having, conversations with a mom who was just always there to listen, and a dad, same thing, coming home, talking to dad. I mean, he always said, "Come talk to me." That was one of his phrases, whether it was with me or a cousin visiting or a boy that was taking me on a date. He'd say, "Come talk to me." That was what my dad said all the time. "Oh, just sit here and talk to me." My dad had time. He made time. And that's why so many people felt so close to him, is because he really did want you to talk to him and to tell him what was going on in your life. And he listened, and sometimes would give advice, but he did it in a way where you never felt threatened. And my mother never gave advice or anything. She just listened. My mother was just an expert at that. And I think it's because she had a big family and lots of siblings, 8 brothers and sisters. So 9 children in her family, and lots of them with their own, life problems and situations. And she just learned to kind of take in that really what people need is a really good listening ear, and not to be judged, but to be supported and listened to. She was just naturally that way. So she was recording all of these things that, I was going through. She'd write things about it, little stories that I still have to this day that she wrote to us as little kids, little poems that she would write. My mother always loved to write. And so when I was asked, and now, this is quite a few years have gone by, and she's written these timelines for me, and life is going on. And so I'm not really focused on telling my story, just knowing I want to tell it in a bigger way, but I didn't know how, I didn't know what, I didn't know when that would really happen, but it was always on my mind. So as I moved to Los Angeles the first time with my little boy, Austin, he was 4 years old when I moved there and got set up in this little cottage in a little back, like a casita type of thing that was in a backyard right in Sherman Oaks, near the park. And was with my son. I talked one time I was trying to figure out how to be an actress in LA without any money, and wouldn't leave my son alone. So I wasn't willing to do some of the things that I think maybe I should have. Well, if that would have been the most important thing to me, but it wasn't. It was being with my son and making sure I was around, that he wasn't in any compromising situations where somebody could hurt him. It was a big deal to me. So, I didn't go to the parties. I didn't do a lot of the probably interacting with, professionals in the industry that were available for me to do at that time. And I didn't have any money to do some of them that were workshops or classes or whatever, to meet the casting directors and things like that. But I did what I could, and I tried. I wanted to act. That had been, the only place that I had ever been paid for anything was in my acting and singing. I'd done some summer stock theater, and I'd done Disney World, and got hired there, and was, a swing. I was very good at memorizing lines and being able to be plugged in to shows. When somebody would get hurt, and then I had regular shows that happened eventually there, and I loved all of that. And I had done enough work. I had done a show up at Sundance. There's an outdoor theater and an indoor theater there, and I had, been paid to be an actress in those shows. And for me, that was the greatest joy of my work life, is I love to act. And I know it saved my life as a kid, going through what I went through, because I could have all the feelings and emotions on stage that I wasn't allowed to show or have in my real life. And so all that rage, I became a very good dramatic actress, and anger, and sadness and grief and pain. And I could just open up, it's like opening up your veins and just letting all of those things come out through the characters, or their, whatever their journeys were. And so that was my love and passion. And it was in that period of time that I had a conversation with a lady that did my hair. I think I told this story. And her husband was an agent at what used to be the William Morris Agency. Now it's a William Morris and I think Creative Artists combined. I think CAA is a combination of both of those agencies coming together, big agencies. And she told her husband, and he was person that could go. And after hearing the story, he started talking to people around, how do we get this woman's story told? I mean, I think this is amazing. And basically pretty much every door shut in his face. He tried over a period of months, and because he thought it was such an incredible story, but everybody said, oh, we don't want to do stories on, child abuse, and nobody wants to touch that, not with a 10-foot pole. So that's basically what came back to me. And it was very disappointing to me at that time. I had developed a pretty thick skin as an actress, like going out and auditioning and not getting the part, because 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100 you don't get it. And so I'd learned not to take it personally. That I got that part. And but I wasn't, telling my story was so personal, and it was something that was so much a part of my development, that I was so tied to it, that it felt very personal when somebody would say, well, nobody wants to tell your story. So I kind of went back into a little bit of a shell about it for a while. And then when I after I had been in California for a while, I told somebody else. There was another person that had kind of come into my life, and I told the story, and they're like, you've got to get that told. Do you have you should, you should write a book, or you definitely need to put it into some kind of on the page sort of story, so that, you could take that book, to people. And that's how people do it now, and again, this is in the 90s, and eventually into the early 2000s. And so I had called my mom and said, everybody that I ever tell the story to, they all tell me the same thing. You gotta write a book, put it into a book. And so I think we should try to do that. And my mom was like, well, yeah, I now have about 800 pages of stuff that I've written about, and, about our family experience, from all of our conversations that we've had through these years, and my own, I think I'm, trying to figure out how, as a mother, I, made the mistakes that I made. And I'm trying to, I've tried to repent for the mistakes that I made, and try to, now I'm a social worker. Mom went back to school and became a social worker. After all of her daughters graduated from college, she went back and went to school, and had just started, I think. I don't know if she'd started college by this. I think she'd started and almost was finished by this point in the early 2000s, and she went to work for the state of Idaho. And she did, foster care, getting children into good foster homes, and trying to reunite families, that had experienced some abuse. But can we train parents? Can we teach them how to do it different, and reuniting families? Because that was a big part of it. And so anyway, and adoptions, she eventually did that as well, helping place children in adoptive families. And anyway, so she was very, now kind of had more education around, around all of these kind of subjects. So she said, well, what I've written so far, I have other things I want to write down. Let's keep talking about this. And so then it became a project between Mom and I. And really it was more, we would have conversations more with, Karen and Susan, my sisters, and with Dad a little bit, but he was like, I don't think I want anything published about our story, still having not really disclosed everything to us. We knew something had happened with Birchtold. We didn't know exactly what it was. And and we were like, you don't have to say anymore. We can just, you don't have to tell anything more. We know that, you went through a repentance process in our church and that you feel terrible about what happened. And none of us, we know you, Dad, and we don't need to put that in the book anyway. He had there was plenty to say and plenty of the story too much of a story actually to tell in a book format. So my mom started working with somebody that was an editor in kind of their life. And also I brought in eventually a person that was an English teacher, but also a writer, who was an actor, writer, director person that I had now done some, acting on film. That started for me in the 90s, that I had done some television and film stuff. And so I knew some people. And so it sort of became this, let's get it through these editors and let's add this and a lot of that back and forth. And so finally, when we finally were like, okay, let's, I think it's ready enough. Had a dear friend that created the cover for us. That was one of my sister's best friends, John. Came up with a beautiful, cool cover with these hands, like a little hands of a little kid, but they almost looked alien. And that's what the cover of the first book, Stolen Innocence, has on it, are these little blue kind of hands, like they're pressing up against a window, but they're almost alien looking, So anyway, we loved that, and he got our cover, ready to go with the right bio and the right picture on the back. He took a picture of me and my mom standing out in front of the mountain and up in northern Utah, and turned out to be a great picture that I love to this day. And that's what's on the back of that first book. And so we self-published it. I had a friend in the neighborhood that her husband was in the publishing world. And so it was just a self-publishing kind of deal that we did. And, nobody to sell our books, and we didn't know what to do with them, but we did it. And it was right around that time in 2003 when we published the book that I'd been asked to speak at this conference for women and their daughters at the university, that had asked me to come and speak. And we had just published the book, and we've been encouraged to publish the book at a different conference that I spoke at, where Superior Court Judge at the time, Charles Gill, had been asked to present, and we were the first day of that weekend long educational conference. And he came up to my mom and I after the first day and said, can I take you to dinner? You have to tell your story. You should publish this. So that had happened a couple years earlier, when I was asked to speak at various things, not for, to make a living or anything like that at the time, just to share my story. I was ready to do that. And I'd created a little, by then we kind of had computers, so to speak. No cell phones yet, but we had some computers around. And that cell phone thing was going to shortly come about. And so it was interesting that the encouragement came from me just saying yes. So as I said yes to different speaking things, friends that knew of my story and were involved in the education system said, we're having a conference. I want to tell them that they should have you come and speak. And I did. And I did that. I met people just because I was willing to say yes to anything and everything that allowed me to share my story. That's how I told my story. I told it from my own mouth in small settings, from a book club to small settings in church settings, like how do you get through trials in life? That's what they wanted me to talk about. I'd tell my story and I'd tell them how I got through it. And it was all these various ways. And then an occasional conference or something, that I'd get invited to speak at. And my mom would always come with me, and we'd do a Q&A at the end. And when we were encouraged to publish our story by that Superior Court judge, who was from Connecticut, and said, look, I'll write a foreword and an afterword for your book if you'll publish, if you want to publish it, because I really think it could help so many people. Because your story kind of contains every aspect of any child abuse case that I worked with as an attorney for 30 years. All the pedophiles, all of those cases that I worked with had to do with sexual assault of children. I mean, almost every single one of them. And your story kind of contains all of it. So do it. And we did. In 2003, when I was speaking at another conference for women and their daughters at a university, that's when Berchtold showed up at that conference. And that was also the year that Elizabeth Smart was missing and was then found. And I had written to the Oprah show the day that she was found and said, look, I have a story to tell and I want to tell it. And it was like one of those years where everything sort of just started to swirl into like reality. We had self-published this book. We went on, when Berchtold showed up at that conference, I was interviewed on Good Morning America by Diane Sawyer, because that little blurb ended up in USA Today for the state of Utah or Idaho. I think it was Utah, because that's where I was speaking to the women and their daughters. And that's where he showed up at that conference and had a gun. He never got inside the building, but he had a gun, and it made the USA Today little blurb. And that's how Good Morning America, and I think the Today Show also asked if I would come on their show, but Good Morning America wanted it exclusive. And so I went and was interviewed on the show by Diane Sawyer. And from that, I had a couple of other shows that called. Montel Williams, I remember, called and wanted to have me on the show. And I was interviewed by Dan Abrams on his show at that time. And I was interviewed by some of the local news stations and stuff like that. And there was a little flurry of stuff. And I thought, oh, good, I'm going to be able to get my story out there. But then again, that all died down and I didn't know what to do next. And so I kept handing out books because I would sometimes get get asked to speak, and maybe I'd sell a few books that way. But most of the time I was just basically giving them away. And for a period of time, we sold some books and we would mail them out. My sister, Susan, basically did that for mom and my books. She would put them in the little padded envelope and mail them off. We'd get these little orders. And so that was all Amazon coming into play at that time. They were a book thing. And so we eventually were able to, join forces there, but they didn't send them. That was up to us. They would get orders and then we'd find out about them. And then my sister Sue would put them in a package and send them. And so, we sold a few thousand books over the period of, the next few years. And it wasn't until I had decided that I was going to now move again from my home in the St. George area. I was going to move back to California. And this was for a lot of reasons, another marriage, things, my stepdaughter had passed away and my marriage had ended, and my son had graduated from high school now. And so I was like, I'm going to see if I can go back to California again and live there and try to be an actress, still trying to chase not only the dream, but how to make a living, because I really wasn't trained in anything but that. And I knew how to do that and I knew I was good at it. So I moved back to California, and at that point, I ended up, doing some intern work for a lady that, was a manager. She had some, pretty big clients that I knew the movies they had been in or TV shows or whatever. And we became friends, and I gave her a book. And she read it and, hugged me. And I interned for her for a period of time, enough time that we became friends, and just a lovely person that she is, to this day. I just cherish her. And she had my book after I had moved on from interning for her and was, still trying to figure out how to get an audition and how to get in the door. I knew if I could get in the door, I would work, because I'm I'm qualified as an actor, but it was hard to get in the door, and still to this day continues to be hard to get in the door. But I got a phone call from her at I don't know, I hadn't been working at her place for a while. And she said, I have another intern who took your book off of my shelf. And she read the whole thing in one night and came back to me and said, Stacy, who is this woman? Do you know her? And how do I get a hold of her? We have to tell her story. And so Stephanie, who is still a dear friend who I give all the credit to for getting the documentary that became Abducted in Plain Sight made, she and I met at a coffee shop in Burbank, California. And she said, and she's younger than me, and, also an actress. And I was like, I have no idea how to get my story told, but yes, whatever you're talking about sounds like a good plan. So what do we do next? And she said, well, let's go after, some really good documentary filmmakers, because I think if we could get a documentary produced, I think that would be, best. And so that's what ended up happening. And we, went and interviewed various, filmmakers and thought their work was lovely and beautiful. And our director filmmaker, Sky, was basically brought into the circle of us three girls, three ladies who wanted to, save all the kids from abuse and grooming and sexual abuse and all the things that had happened. And so we all started on this journey, and then I became just basically the what the story was about. And I really didn't know what to do in the producer role of that. And so I stepped to the other side of the line, is how they call it, as just, the subject of the story. I did a little bit of trying to, help raise some funds, so we could hire, different people. And eventually that documentary got finished and made. It took a long time. I mean, from the first conversation with Stephanie that I had in 2013, maybe 2014. So from publishing that first book in 2003, 10 years later, going back, I've been back in California for a while. My son graduated in 2007. And so by 2008, I had moved out of my home and was basically living in California in a little apartment and trying to, make enough money to pay my bills and live my dream, trying to figure out how to get in the door to be an actress. And kept getting pulled back, sometimes to Utah, because everybody knew me there, and I'd done some movie of the weeks, and I'd done enough acting there that I had a name for myself in the Utah market, where the film and television industry was starting to really, there was a lot happening there, which I didn't even know. So anyway, I look at that period of time, how much time that I just kept talking about my story, and I wanted to tell my story, and not knowing who I would meet, how I would meet them, and when it would happen, and what would happen. I had no idea that Abducted in Plain Sight, that documentary, would not only, get made, and, it was so compelling. It was so well done. Hats off to, Emily, who was another producer that came on board for that, Stephanie, Sky, and many others who behind the scenes were, you know, putting together something that I had no idea would go viral, would resonate with people the way it did. And hats off to my family members who were so vulnerable to be so honest and truthful in their telling of what they did and what happened to them, and how they were groomed and manipulated and blackmailed, and the mistakes that they made, and being just so honest. My family, I had other people who were interviewed for the documentary that were not even in it. I hope someday to get all of that footage and be able to do something more with all the other interviews that didn't make the final cut, my friend Caroline and several of our dear friends, that I mean, there was only maybe a brief moment or two from, the FBI agent Pete Welch and our friend Cor Hoffman and others that were, maybe had one moment in the documentary, but there was so much to tell. They just all were so generous to give the story from their points of view, and thank goodness we got that before, my dad died, and several others. My FBI agent Pete has passed now, and Cor Hoffman as well. And I'm just grateful to all of my friends and the people that were around my story in so many different ways for sharing, their perspective, even if it didn't make the final cut of that documentary. And when it went viral, it was so unexpected because I I mean, you're hoping to raise enough money that you can get a color correction specialist and a really great Emmy winning editor, which we got, and people that came on board for just a short period of time that were around the project long enough to make it really amazing. And so it went viral. And that is what afforded me other opportunities to talk to other people. And as that happened, my sisters and I, and my mom, my dad had passed before it came out on Netflix. So my dad passed in November of 2018, and it came to Netflix in January 2019. Anyway, that period of time where there was so much, I was asked to be on, a variety of shows that, like Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz and Tamron Hall, and many other podcasts and radio interviews, and local television news stories, and lots of stuff that went on in 2019 with that. And I had moved from Los Angeles back to Utah to take a job as the executive director of a theater, which is another thing I know how to do. I know how to start and run theater and performing arts centers. That's where my passion in my work life is in bringing the arts and in acting. And so I had come back to do that job, got to have a job, keep your passion going. Still want to be an actress, still want my own TV show. So gotta have a meeting with people that are doing the kind of work that I want to do, and figuring out how to continue that work. Like with Mariska, I want to talk to her about her Law and Order SVU and ideas that I have about a show that I want to produce. And anyway, that will continue to do the great work of opening up the conversation around the huge problem that we have with sexual assault and abuse and childhood violence that is continuing to affect our lives forever, and until we actually get the awareness, which will spark prevention. And in order to have prevention happen, we have to have laws change as well, and we have to have support for those who have survived rape, incest, abuse, violence, trafficking, all of the above. We have to have the resources for people to heal, and the resources for those who are in charge of those terrible crimes to have more training, for our police and our detectives and our social workers and our medical doctors and our therapists and all of it, to have that trauma informed, and to have enough people to actually do what needs to be done. Sorry, got off on my soapbox there. Back to how I told my story. So as that went viral, I would never have known how to have a meeting with anyone that could write or produce or would fund, putting a television show, a series together. I would not have known how to get to those people. They came to me at that point. They started calling. And over time, we finally were able to find the right fit. And that was Nick and Alex, who Eat the Cat, their production company, saw the value of the story beyond the documentary, which was just the headlines. Not that that was a bad thing, but it wasn't the full story. It definitely did not meet what I wanted to do in telling my story. It met the fact that I got an opportunity, but telling headlines from sexual assault stories does not show people how grooming, manipulation, and how long term abuse can happen to our children, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 6 boys, as the current statistics are, that will be sexually assaulted. It doesn't tell you how that happens and why the problem is so big. It does not show you what happens and why it's somebody you know, almost always, not a stranger. And so I knew that I was going to get hopefully some opportunities because the documentary went viral. And I knew what I wanted to say that was still left unsaid. And those were the two things. It's hardly ever a scary stranger. It's someone you know, already love, already trust, who is grooming you and your child and is the predator, the abuser. It's, the cat and mouse game that they're playing with you, and you don't know they're playing a game with you because they look like your relative. They look like your school teacher. They look like, the coach. They look like somebody you can trust, that you already love. They look like grandpa. They look like your uncle, your aunt, your cousin, your sibling. That's who is harming the majority of these children. That's who is trafficking their children. It's not a scary stranger. That was one. The second thing, the point that I wanted to make, is that it is common. It is happening everywhere, in every system you can imagine. It is happening in your church, in your community, in your community center, in your business. The people are groomed, and because of fear, or because they just don't know how to talk about it, because they don't have the language, nor do they often know that this isn't okay because they almost grew up with it, that, it's just, those things were so important, and I didn't feel like we had gotten to those things. So when I got that call from Nick and Alex, I knew that they got it. I knew that the first question that they asked was, how are you doing and how is your family? This must be really hard. Because, you have all the haters, the people that don't believe you or that blame your parents. And I'm like, gosh, the only person that's to blame is that predator, that perpetrator. He knew exactly what he was doing in the way that he groomed and manipulated every person in our family and me. And, I just was so shocked. Like, that's where the blame goes. I mean, yes, if it's a parent abusing the child, that's where the blame goes. But that was not the case for me. So it was a really interesting to have somebody know that this must be hard. And are you guys okay? And then to talk about how maybe we could create a series that would literally take you down that path with these amazing actors, amazing producers, with amazing, platform like Peacock and, the NBC Universal, machinery behind Peacock, and all of the people that were involved in telling my story in A Friend of the Family. It was like something came true for me that started when I was 27, really in earnest, knowing I wanted to tell my story and protect my child, that my story might be able to protect other children from this ever happening to them, and might also educate parents who love their children and just don't see what is really hard to see, because it's really hard to stomach that it's grandpa, or that it's a relative, or an older sibling, or even a younger sibling that's just bigger and more manipulative. It happens in all these circumstances. And I just all of a sudden had a project that I could help produce. I could help by being in the writer's room and saying, oh, that makes it too simple. Like, can we change just those couple of words so that it's not as easy for people to see what's right there for them to see? Or making sure that the blame didn't go in the wrong places. Like, even though we met this family at my church, I met this man, his wife, his 5 kids at church. I didn't want the church to be blamed for his actions. I want there to be changes in how we handle abuse in systems like churches, religions, that it isn't swept under the rug. It isn't dealt with in-house. These are crimes. These people they have to be reported to the police. And I want to make sure that children and boys and girls, teenagers, women and men who say they're abused, that they're believed. I know the things that I want to have happen that aren't perfect in a lot of systems, especially patriarchal systems that we deal with in society. They've been unfair to women and children for a long time, and they need to have change. There has to be some changes, but they weren't to blame for this man's actions. They were to blame for things that needed to have been changed and disclosed to keep me safe, that would have kept me safe, because this man should have been removed from our congregation before, because he had had other incidents before me. So there are things that, I wanted the story to be told in a truthful, honest way that would really, truly reflect our family story. And for all of my intentions and purposes, that happened. That story, A Friend of the Family, it's so well done by the actors, by the writers, the producers, and the platform is such that it can be, you can buy the series on Apple TV now and watch it. It's still, you can stream it on Peacock if you have that platform. And it has given me it's not like I'm finished. Like I'm always going to be telling my story, because I'm always wanting to tell people that they can tell their story. And so that's why now with the Jan Broberg Foundation and our podcast, our online community, Thrivivors, and making legislative changes and educational awareness happen and helping people heal is all I do now. That's my whole life. And I hope that, that it will be of service in the ways that I had always hoped my story would be of service. And it has served me. Telling my story and getting these opportunities were things that I never could have imagined, but I never stopped. So from age 27 until that series happened, which was just in these last few years, like 2020, the end of 2020 or early 2021, while COVID was happening, the pandemic was everywhere around the world, is when we came to the agreement that this is what we're going to do. It's going to happen. Let's sign on the dotted line. Let's get our pitch ready. Let's get the right platform. Let's get all the right people around it, and let's tell the full story. And that's just the childhood story. Now I want to do another season, another series that can show how life goes after the aftermath, and how it relates to what happened during those years. So if anybody out there wants to see that happen and is a producer, let me know, because I am definitely working on an outline for a multi-season, many seasons, to tell the rest of the story, which is the journey from age 16 to 61. Those two ages backwards. I was 16 when I started to talk, and I'm now 61, and I'm in the best health and shape of my life, and I'm ready to branch out and to produce and be in another series that I have percolating. So I will always be an advocate. I will always share my story when asked. I will do everything I can to help other people share theirs so their healing process can begin. I don't know how I did it. I just know that I never stopped talking. And it happened. And you can do that too. Even if it's only for an audience of one, that one person that you tell and talk to will not only help you on your journey, but it might just save someone else's life. Thanks for being a part of it, all of it, with me.